let's get started. So hi everyone, my name is Maria Gomez. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a graduate student here at UMD, and I'm working with the Institute in the Environment this year to put together the sustainability panels that are related to the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. We just think that it's very important that this conversation and action around the sustainability goals continue. And this is a project that is funded by IonE Twin Cities and the Rapid Response Grant through the GPS Alliance. We've tried to put these panels together this semester, working with faculty, so these conversations can directly benefit the classes and the students and everyone else here today. So we are kind of taking these SDG goals and interweaving them into the curriculum and showcasing sustainability and the work that is being done by UMD faculty and faculty in the U of M system. And also thank you, Dr. Bell, for allowing us to set up this panel and work with you on this. So just a reminder, this conversation has live captioning and will be recorded and will be later be put in the IonE Duluth website for future academic use. We will start the panel and the questions prepared by Dr. Bell, and then we will open up to questions from the audience around 1:35 p.m. And before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Duluth is located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The university resides on land that was cared for and called home by the Ojibwe people, before them the Dakota and the Northern Cheyenne people and other Native peoples from time immemorial. Ceded by the Ojibwe in an 1854 treaty, this land holds great historical, spiritual, and personal significance for its original stewards, the Native nations and peoples of this region. We recognize and continually support and advocate for the sovereignty, I cannot say that word, of the Native nations in this territory and beyond. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm tribal sovereignty and will work to hold the University of Minnesota Duluth accountable to American Indian peoples and nations. So with that being said, Dr. Bell, we can go ahead and get started.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you and also thank you to Maria for organizing this panel. Wow, what a ton of effort. And I am giddy beside myself, excited for it. As Maria said, it's being sponsored by the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota, which is a system-wide organization. She has arranged for 4 outstanding panelists, and I am excited about that because my area is organizations and management. I am not an expert in science, and the more I learn about sustainability from a business perspective, the more I realize the big problem is my students need to know the science, and I can't do that. And I am absolutely thrilled to death that we've got 4 people who can help them with that. I am not going to give them a formal introduction because, as Maria said, we've got our cheat sheet of questions. And I think what we're going to do is combine the first 2 together, and they can also form your introductory statements. So basically, the first question was, tell us a little bit about your training and what you study, how you became interested in that, and how it relates to the study of climate change. And the second question is, what does your training tell us about how the Earth's environment is changing and how fast it's changing? And the reason I added that question was because during our conversations during the class that I teach here right now, it became apparent that a lot of the students came into the class with the idea that, well, this is something my grandkids and kids will have to deal with. I'm okay. And I've heard increasing comments both from the students in the room and the students on the Zoom meeting that, oh my goodness, it's now, it's here, etc. So I would very much appreciate your perspective on that. So basically the first one is, tell us a little bit about who you are, what you study, etc. And then what does your knowledge tell us about how the environment's changing? I think we may as well just go in order of our 4 panelists here for the first question. So I'm going to start with Teresa Bertossi, Dr. Teresa Bertossi from Environmental Sustainability and Geography here at UMD.
Hi, thanks everyone for being here and for inviting me to the panel. As Dr. Bell explained, I teach in the geography department. I have 2 geography degrees with a focus on natural resources analysis and environmental management, so more of a physical geography. But I took a different direction for my PhD in sustainability education. And briefly, that was because of my experiences in the field of natural resources and in the working for National Park, Forest Service with endangered species management and mining policy. So kind of a wide variety of topics. And most of the time jobs were pitted against nature. And that was frustrating for me coming from a very low income family from the mountains of West Virginia. So I frequently found myself unable to answer what kind of livelihood can we have where people can make ends meet and still work within the biophysical limits of the natural world. I also direct the UMD Land Lab and teach sustainability and ecological economics courses. So the second question was, what does my training tell me? I think I kind of answered that, but we're certainly modifying our biophysical, physical, chemical, biological limits very fast. And working in endangered species management, I realized what we were doing wasn't working. And often those government agencies were pitted against local people. And having come from a family that was very uneducated, I was a first-gen scholar, I'd had a lot of practice in that arena, kind of walking between those worlds. So that's kind of where my training led me to better understand that change. And just to sum up, my latest research was traveling around Lake Superior to reach out and communicate with small rural communities in the realm of agriculture and natural resources about their ideas for sustainable business practices and livelihoods. So I think I answered those 2 questions. Thanks for your time.
Sweet. Thank you. Next, we have Jessica Savage, who's in our biology department here at UMD. Jessica, the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you. So my pronouns are she and her. I'm in the biology department, but my specialty is actually plants and plant biology. I started a little bit more broad in the field of ecology. So thinking about how plants and organisms interact with each other and in the environment. But as I continued on my degree, especially even after I got my PhD, I became much more focused in trying to understand how plants work. So plant physiology. And, you know, it's interesting spending most of my time in research studying the way that plants grow, deal with stress, respond to the environment. It's hard to think of a part of my research experience that doesn't touch climate change, even when it hasn't been directly tied to it, because the way that we see the world right now has already been impacted by changes that have occurred and are continuing to occur. And it's really impossible in many ways to study how organisms relate outside of the context of our current world, right? If you're doing it outside, at least. And, but in terms of direct connections, my interest in climate change has really delved into some recent phenomenons that we're seeing and maybe less talked about things, which are, sometimes they're called false springs, where it warms up in the spring and then we have a late frost. We've always had late frosts periodically, but we're having an increase of freezing damage in the spring because we often see a shift in when plants produce new growth. And the thought is that this is being driven by warming. And so I'm really interested in plant freezing tolerance, when they produce leaves, when they produce flowers, and how is that changing? And I do that in natural systems, thinking about our tree species. And I also do it in horticultural systems and agricultural systems, because this is impacting all ways that we interact with plants. And so when thinking about what my training is telling me about the changing world, and the time frame of it especially, I see sort of like two different scales. So on one hand, I think about what are the plants that we have here now, like the crop plants that we have out in the field, the cherry trees, the apple trees that are out there now. They're experiencing immediate effects from what's happening now. Like we are starting to see an increase of frost damage in the spring in this effect, and it's affecting crop production. And it will continue to. But I also think about the fact that we're just starting. We're going to see some big changes within our lifespan, because plants and any living organism doesn't respond like to tiny increments. They respond to, they often have like a threshold. Like if it's within this range, it's going to do this one thing, but once it hits something, there's going to be a shift. And I think that there is the potential for being some bigger shifts that are going to happen within our lifetime that is going to cause a larger impact in what plants are doing and how they're growing.
Cool. Sort of scary. Maybe you have better words than, you know, when you mentioned that, all I could think of was I moved to Duluth. It seems like a lifetime ago now. It was 2001. So I've been here 20 years this spring. And when I came here, cardinals were occasional summer visitors, and now they're here 12 months of the year. They've expanded their range that much. I, for the first time this season, went out last night and started spraying my garden with deer repellent, because my bulbs are starting to pop their way through, and that shouldn't happen in Duluth in late March. So I can see some of those things that you talk about, Jessica. They're right out in my front yard right now. Our third speaker is Dr. Melissa Kenney from the Institute on the Environment. I'm assuming, Melissa, that you're based out of the Twin Cities, but feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, I am Melissa Kenney. I'm Director of Research and Knowledge Initiatives at the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment, out of the Twin Cities campus, but IonE, or the Institute on the Environment, spans all 5 campuses. So I'm particularly happy to be here with you all in Duluth today. So my training is as a decision scientist. So I do environmental decision analysis, and I got to my training because I was an undergrad in environmental science. And it was really interesting when I was at the University of Virginia to learn about all of the different natural systems, but it seemed like it was really missing this human component. And when I thought about how we could better manage the environment, I really wanted to look more at sort of some of the policy angle of how we brought science into decision making. So I did my PhD at Duke University and actually spent half my time in the Nicholas School of the Environment, where I got my PhD, but half my time in the Fuqua School of Business, because they have an entire team of decision analysts who think about how do you make really smart decisions when you have multiple objectives, sometimes competing, and there's really hard trade-offs that we have to think about. And at the time I was doing my PhD, I thought, why aren't we using this more within the environment? This describes perfectly the kind of environmental management decisions that we're making. And going down that rabbit hole to think about policy thresholds and trade-offs and indicators, and really the processes and tools that enable evidence-based decision-making, and how science can better get into decisions within governments and organizations has really motivated my work over the past 15 years or so. And in doing that work, I'm actually not a Minnesotan. I'm a Minnesotan by choice. I came here about 2 years ago. I'm really excited. And prior to that, I was a total US East Coaster. I spent time in Virginia, North Carolina. Then I went up to Maryland, was at Johns Hopkins University and the University of Maryland, and actually spent a couple of years embedded in the US federal government under the Obama administration, working at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as well as an office under the White House called the US Global Change Research Program that coordinates the entire portfolio of global change and climate change research that happens within the government across 13 different agencies and departments. It's a $4.5 billion portfolio, and it was really exciting to be there when we were really thinking creatively about how we could provide scientific information like indicators to US citizens to empower them to make smarter decisions. And so that kind of work has really motivated me, because I started off in water quality and moved into climate change about a decade ago. And here's what I know. I know climate change processes are incredibly well known. They've been established for well over 150 years. So the mechanisms of greenhouse gases causing climate change is settled science. We also know that humans are causing it. There's no dispute. There's literally no mechanism where climate change can be happening where humans are not causing it. The other thing is that the changes that we are seeing are at a rate that has never been seen before. And that rate of change is what you should be paying attention to, because it is not slow moving. It is not something that's slow and easy to adapt to. The climate impacts that we are seeing, even in a place like Minnesota right now, are visible and have been visible within our lifespans, whether we're 20 years old or whether we're 60 years old. And a couple of those changes that you might have noticed is you might have noticed warmer winters in Minnesota. You might have noticed shifts in the kinds of plants and animals and the timing at which you see those, birds or plants bloom and flower and show up. You might have seen new plants and animals starting to arrive in places that they never have been before. And you might have noticed changes in extreme events like heavier precipitation events like rainfalls and floods that occur from those changes. The other thing that we see in impacts right now, not into the future, right now, is that these impacts disproportionately impact those people who are already marginalized. So the changes that are happening have an equity and justice lens to it that cannot be ignored if we are to be doing this kind of work with integrity. And so the one thing I would say is that climate change is not hopeless. The reason I'm a decision scientist is because the power that we have to change things, whether it's in the environment or our own life, is with the choices that we make. And so we have the power to make different choices as individuals and as a society that will fundamentally change the trajectory that we are on now and lessen the impacts of climate change, both for us, but also for future generations.
Yay, I like that. We'll get back to hopefully more of those what can we do kind of things in a little bit, and also what brings hope, because I think oftentimes this conversation is seen as nothing but bad news and oh my God. And it's nice to hear that maybe there's going to be some good news in all that. And hopefully we can all get some good news from all you people before we say goodbye. Last but not least is Lisa DeGuire, who's a grad student over in Swenson, and she's doing water resource science. Tell us more about your story and what you're interested in, please, Lisa.
Yeah, so I guess I'm kind of taking the water resources angle on this, but yes, as you mentioned, I am a master's student in the water resources science program, and I have an undergrad degree in biology and environmental studies. And I think in terms of my interest in this field, it was partially fueled by just growing up on the Great Lakes, but then aided by a really cool research opportunity I had on Lake Michigan. So after college, I kind of narrowed in on the water side of biology and environmental studies and spent 4 years working at an urban water quality nonprofit in Baltimore, Maryland. And then I moved back to Michigan, where I'm from, to work with the National Park Service at Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore on the water quality team. And that was before starting grad school. And so in grad school, one component of my research involves looking at the genetic material in environmental waters like streams and beaches to kind of start identifying the sources of the fecal contamination or E. coli advisories. So whether they're human sources or geese or sediment or livestock, because the source of pollution impacts both the risks and the solutions. And that kind of relates to climate change because one of, stormwater is one of the main mechanisms for the transport of fecal contamination and many other different pollutants into our waterways, whether it's excess nutrients or sediments or road salt. And what we're seeing with climate change is that we're seeing an increase in these extreme weather events. So kind of surge events, intense rain and flooding events, which, as they move, they carry more pollutants from the land into our waterways. And they also put pressure on our stormwater and sewer infrastructure, which can lead to sewer overflows, which again gets back to more poop in the water, which is what I'm studying. So I guess that's one kind of component of the water resource and climate change angle, just the stormwater and increased storm events. But then there's also the water distribution aspect, because only about 1% of all of the water on Earth is usable fresh water. So that makes it a pretty precious resource. And in fact, some people are saying that in the Middle East, it's more of a valuable resource than oil. But yeah, so with climate change, we're seeing more droughts and desertification in some areas. And then in other areas, we're seeing these huge floods. So we're seeing water starting to redistribute itself around the globe. And while climate change, it is a threat to everyone's health, and it does impact everyone. Like was just mentioned, it is disproportionately impacting our most vulnerable populations. So during my time in Baltimore, I saw that the most vulnerable groups were the communities that were seeing the highest numbers of heat wave related deaths and the most sewage overflows in their basements from, pipes that burst and not being prioritized. And, the people experiencing homelessness are obviously quite impacted and exposed to the elements. And, people in certain communities may not be able to relocate as easily as we see more of these impacts of climate change. So, whether or not you are being impacted as much as those communities right now, we all will at some point be impacted by climate change, whether it's food access or storm events, again, which we're already seeing, here in Duluth. So yeah, that's a little bit about me and kind of a taste of the water side of things.
No pun intended then with the taste of the water side. Truth in advertising, and this ties into something Lisa said. I'm from Winnipeg originally, so I actually moved to Duluth to help people understand what a nice climate in winter it really is. The scary thing is it's not nearly as cold in Winnipeg as it used to be, but something that Lisa, you might find really interesting given your interest in E. coli. We used to have a lake place on the east side of Lake Winnipeg, took my dog up and my wife would go up for years before we sold it. And Miss Annie dog, this precedes Mr. Jet, who you've all seen. Annie Velda was very insistent. Annie does not drink out of the fancy water that we got from the artesian well. She drinks the tap water, and she got really sick. And I wasn't sure why. She had diarrhea. She had iron stomach. She could do anything. And a week after, I keep getting news reports from CBC Manitoba, and a week later they issued a boil water advisory for Victoria Beach, which is where our lake was, for E. coli in the water. And then I think it was 3 winters ago, Lisa, you may or may not have heard of this. For the first time, they found traces of E. coli in the ice in Lake Winnipeg. It's the first time E. coli had been found overwintering in the lake. So there's some really weird things, and you're doing really important work. Let's move on to the next set of questions, and maybe we can just let people respond sort of as the spirit moves them. About one of the things that we deal with in business is people who, for a variety of reasons, maybe not doubting climate change, but certainly not as positively responding to it because we face issues related to the bottom line, the famous bottom line. And how would you suggest and potentially manage some of the difficult conversations around climate change with people whose views perhaps are different than some of the people in this Zoom meeting? And what are your best sources of information that my students and the other students here can pick up on and use to help say, here's some really good, credible stuff, and how do you approach those conversations? I'll let you take it as you want to, whatever order you want.
I mean, I would say the business sector is already paying attention to this. I mean, if you look at Moody's, if you're not reporting on your climate risk, you're not being transparent with your shareholders, and it is being used to make judgments about credit worthiness. And so, I mean, climate change isn't a belief system. There might be different attitudes around climate change and climate solutions, but climate change is a set of facts. It's not a religion. And so I would say that if you're not paying attention to what's already happening within the business sector and how they're trying to account for these risks, which are real and impacting businesses, impacting supply chains, and they're needing to account for it within their practices, then you're missing opportunities to be thoughtful in the way that you're advising or making your own business decisions, because you're not accounting for critical information that will impact your bottom line.
I think one other thing that Teresa already kind of hit on is, keeping those conversations away from those false dichotomies. Are you, do you believe in climate change, or are you pro jobs? That's not those aren't really true opposites, because certain renewable energies are some of the fastest growing job areas, and they're sustainable jobs that aren't necessarily like boom or bust. And are you pro environment, or are you pro economy? And there are so many different industries and economies that are intrinsically linked to healthy communities and ecosystems, whether it's tourism industry or ecotourism, or a lot of agriculture is based on having healthy natural resources. So I think kind of staying away from those false dichotomies, this or that, is important.
So I can chime in here. I mean, I don't often have a situation where I'm talking to people specifically in the business field, but one thing I find when I do a lot of education and outreach, and I do a fair amount with community involved science up here and citizen science programs, is that a lot of people have personal anecdotes. People pay attention to what's happening, and they may not have framed it in the context of climate change, especially if they have ideas about it that have been long standing. It's really hard to shift somebody's mentality. But I think there is value in just trying to help acknowledge what we are seeing. And from a plant perspective, that there is the opportunity of people's connection with the land, which I feel is very strong in Minnesota. People have an awareness of the land around them, around Lake Superior. People have a strong attachment to the lake. And also in terms of things like agriculture and horticulture, these are things that humans in general are invested in. And you will find if you talk to people that people have their own stories, and sometimes connecting with those stories and letting them be able to vocalize them can help get a connection to the issue, even if it's not a sort of direct conversation about how am I going to tell them about climate change. It's something that you can just continually engage in whatever way you're interacting with people.
To connect to what Jessica just said, when I traveled around the lake for a couple of years, I was in a little tugboat. My students were in little kayaks. I'm afraid of water, so I didn't take the kayak route. But what I did do was digital storytelling. I have a student currently working on trying to get those online, just letting people talk about their stories. I have an agriculture background as well. And so I work a lot with fishermen, fisher people. I interviewed a lot of people on reservations or First Nations on the North Shore, people who are dependent on hunting and fishing. And I think even though there are a lot of reasons from race to class, legitimate reasons people are skeptical of science and of government. And I think that's really important to consider. But as Jessica mentioned, people will talk to no end about how their livelihoods have changed, how their small businesses are being affected, and there was common ground. The North Shore in Canada, more folks across the race and class seem to consider climate change science than on the North Shore of Lake Superior, and I thought that was very interesting. But everything from conflict, right, between rural communities and Indigenous communities, because there are only so many licenses to hunt moose or reindeer or whitefish, right? All of these things are affecting people's lives. And people said, my family has hunted moose and we no longer can. And at one point on that trip, I saw a moose swim to its death due to brain problems, and had to call a local First Nation about that so that they could try to fish out the body and do some work on it. So I think both Lisa and Jessica made really good points about dichotomies, cross race, ethnicity, class, people who are skeptical of science and understanding why. I just think those are really critical. And when you get down to the small details, which is what people can relate to more, and I'm a geographer, so I know the spatial calamities we're facing, people only have so much capacity, right, to hold so much in their minds, and we all only have so much capacity to think about big pictures. And so whenever we talk about small scenarios, that ice fishing isn't something they get to do anymore. There was, or talk to small business folks about what was inhibiting or what were the barriers, or talk to farmers about some of the policy barriers to their interest in making sustainability changes, So I think those would be my recommendations too. I think those are recurring themes.
Nice. I appreciate that. I like the idea of telling stories and relating to one another like that. I'm looking at time. In interest of time, maybe we can go directly to, if you each could recommend one or two things that my students and I should all be doing differently to make the world a better place, what would you tell us to do or quit doing at your choice?
Well, I can start with probably an obvious one. I mean, there's lots of things you can do like individually, but I actually think being aware and voting is probably one of the more important things. You know, becoming aware of what are the issues and what is going on. Yeah, and being active about it, both at a political level and also socially in your local sphere, whatever that is.
So get active. Nice.
I think my recommendation, I have 2 resources I put in the chat, so I won't spend too much time on that. But Kate Rayworth's Donut Economies, I think, is a great book. And Making Other Worlds Possible, Performing Diverse Economies, everything from indigenous perspectives to innovation. And I think my recommendation for one thing that you could do is, we are so enveloped in an economic system that, especially in this country, doesn't consider Earth biophysical limits or our social foundations, that go along with that. And that's the Donut Economies book I recommended. But I think it's to think outside of the box, consider your own worldview, consider what it is that you know, and to really be open to knowing and innovating new ways forward. Not to think we're stuck, because we've created these systems. We could create new ones. And that kind of gets back to that dichotomies of, oh, well, that's socialism or capitalism if you change the economy. And that's not necessarily so. As Melissa mentioned, these are facts, our biophysical limits, and that a lot of conventional economics courses don't discuss biophysical limits, I think, is of grave concern.
Now, for the students in my class, I did not tell her to say that, because the week after next, we're actually looking at sustainability and innovation in the class. So pay attention to your readings, because Teresa says it's important. Thank you so much. Other last thoughts before we go to Q&A?
Let me just echo again what Jessica and Teresa have said, is that these larger scale systemic changes that happen through policies and mega organizations are critically important, and we are not going to get to large scale changes without them. I would also say that we all individually have a role to play, and one thing that we can do, well, I'll say 2 things we can do. One is we can do sort of a personal, like, carbon audit on our own lives and kind of figure out where in our own lives are we potentially using more carbon, and are there ways to be able to use less of it. And I'm not going to make judgments of exactly what those solutions are, whether it's reducing, meat consumption or driving cars or, managing one's land, because the exact solutions are very context specific and very individual. And I think that being, stewards of our environment requires just sort of thoughtful consideration of where we individually can make changes. The second thing is that I am very concerned with how we've wrapped facts into sort of an ideological representation of who we are. And I would just encourage everyone to be questioning about and be open to rethinking. And there was a book that was just recently published by Adam Grant, who's an organizational psychologist at the Wharton School, at the University of Pennsylvania called Think Again, where he poses the sort of like opportunity to actually be better in our own lives, be better in our own decision making, and also be more profitable in our decisions by not being locked into a particular ideology or sort of belief system, and instead using it as a testable hypothesis where we question why we might be wrong instead of seeking why we might be right. And I think if we think about climate change and other decisions that we make within the same kind of mindset, we are more likely to be creative in our solutions and effective in our problem solving.
Nice. Lisa, would you like to give us any last words before we open up for Q&A?
I mean, Melissa really just hit on almost exactly what I was going to say in terms of doing kind of that like carbon footprint personal analysis and finding, you know, what some of the best, most impactful things you can do on your own personal scale. Because for me, I'm a renter. So some of the biggest sources of greenhouse gases include, you know, the energy production and then also the food production. So since I'm a renter, I don't have very much power over how my energy is generated. That's not something I really have much power over, but I do have power over what I buy and eat. So you know, I'm not saying everyone should go out and become a vegetarian today, but if you're someone that maybe eats meat every day, you know, trying a meatless Monday, you know, little things like that to think of how we can shift toward more of a plant-based diet, because livestock production generates some of the highest greenhouse emissions within the food industry. But again, yeah, everyone has different lives, and finding what works for you, I think, is an important step.
Thank you, everyone, for your comments. I would love to open the floor up to questions either from either of the people in the room or from everyone on Zoom. Any questions for any or all of our panel?
I have a question for basically anybody in the panel. What do you guys think is probably one of the most, or could have the most impact? Like, what industry could have the most impact from changing it? Or what industry do you think is having the most impact and it needs to be prioritized the most for change? So like agriculture, technology, transportation.
Well, I think I think all of the industries you just said, like I kind of previously mentioned, the energy sector right now is one of the biggest contributors, followed closely by food production and transportation. Those are kind of some of the biggest sources of. So I think that ultimately it's not going to be any one industry. It is going to have to be a mix of solutions across all industries.
So if we look at Minnesota, and not just where the wedges are, but where there is active policies in place to reduce carbon emissions over the next 30 years, our energy sector is actually on track to be at zero emissions by 2050. And that's a great thing because we don't have fossil fuel resources in Minnesota. So for us to be energy independent, it requires a really robust portfolio of renewable energy and really thinking about that system critically. If you look at a sector like the ag, forestry, and other working land sector, that is the one sector where there have literally been no plans or policies put into place about how to reduce emissions. Currently, if you look at legislature that's going through both federal the federal government, but also things that are happening at the state level. There's a lot of interest in being able to reduce carbon emissions on agricultural lands. And I would just say, like, yes, that is important. We should not ignore the opportunities to be good stewards of our environment on our ag lands. But we need to be really careful about how they're doing the accounting. Agricultural lands are not a long-term carbon sink, and so we need to be really careful about how we're setting up emissions programs around the ag sector, because we might be counting and paying a lot of money for no outcome. And when we just did an analysis of Minnesota lands using, biochar and other best management practices that are promoted, the best that we could get, like putting best management practices on the land, was about a 16 to 20% reduction in carbon emissions. Doing best management practices at a very ambitious rate that would be very difficult to achieve. So one of our best strategies is actually making sure that land doesn't get converted from forest land or other long-term carbon sinks, especially wetlands, which are huge carbon sinks. And that's not translated into other lands where you have massive carbon outputs.
We may have time for one or two more questions. Anyone have any last questions? If not, I'm going to piggyback on Annika's question and go to Jessica. And okay, I'm ignorant. I've said that already, so I get to show it to everyone. The question was the big three: energy, agriculture, and transportation. To what extent, based on your knowledge, is going local in our agriculture going to solve some of those feedback loops that I saw in that? Because if I'm transporting all my lettuce from California in the middle of January, it seems to me that that's transportation and energy intensive. Or am I finding false solutions because I have to grow lettuce in a greenhouse in Minnesota? Is there a solution there, or am I full of it like normal?
It's a great question, and I'm not sure that I know all of the pieces of that. It could be that Melissa or some of the others have a better idea. It is inherently challenging for us to produce all of our own food locally for many reasons, and I think that there will be a lot of changes too that result in what we can grow and where. So warming will actually allow some things to be grown in areas and others not. So it gets to be complicated. We do pretty good in Minnesota for certain types of crops, but we have a high dependency on many things that people do not want to give up, like coffee and chocolate, things like that. That I don't think there really is a feasible way to grow them here. But in terms of those trade-offs, I don't know. I'd like to see if one of the other panels could have some insight there.
If there's time, I can kind of address this. So at the UMD Land Lab, we work on habitat restoration, but also food systems, and we're working with local organizations to try to provide food to people who can't afford local and organically produced food. As well as the other piece of that, we work closely with farmers who are struggling to have a livelihood, especially in the Northland, because farming is so different because of the physical geography here, right? That policy doesn't always even recognize that it is farming. If you have a few pigs and a few turnips and you supplement with fish. But I just want to add that I don't think Europeans ever really figured out how to eat here well. When we arrived, Indigenous peoples utilized a great deal of land in this region. Anishinaabe people ate all the way up through the Dakotas, right? And then it takes a lot of land to eat in a good way. So we have some innate struggles in regard to population and how to feed people. There's a lot about organic ag, and we practice, organic, though we can't afford the certification out there. There are a lot of inefficiencies, right? And I ran a farm for 10 years prior to getting my PhD, and we used a lot of plastics and a lot of inputs with our organic ag that, those problems haven't been solved. So I think in response to what you're saying, food is complex and there isn't an easy way out, although we're looking at extension in regard to seasons, and our diets would have to be very seasonal. Looking at what plants were native or may be native, able to grow here in the future and that we can eat. I think it's going to be a real challenge. And I think that's an ongoing question that you've asked.
Although I think there are some tools within sort of our business toolkit that we can draw on. I mean, I think the big thing that you're pointing out is that these are complex systems, and that you have to really understand the complexity of those systems and the trade-offs that are inherent within those systems to actually have the information to know whether or not the, dichotomous choice that you presented, whether one approach is more effective than the other, because there are scale of economies. When you do things, there are like potential savings in greenhouse gases by consolidation, in various productions. There are ways of structuring things that are more effective. And we also can't ignore the sort of inequalities that exist of wanting to make sure that people have access to affordable food, and that's not, and that's available for everyone. And we live a very modern lifestyle, and, it's not easy to sort of like just live off the land like we may have 100 or 200 years ago. We really do have a different way of living, and that convenience factor is something we can't ignore, or elsewise when we think about the behaviors and how we create large scale change, we can't actually implement solutions that are going to be meaningful at scale. And so I would just say tools like life cycle analysis, supply chain analysis, incorporating sort of the triple bottom line within sort of the business analyses that you're doing are really important tools to really understand the overall costs and benefits, or emissions from various sources that that are occurring throughout the system, throughout the supply chain, so that you can make a truly informed decision.
Well, as so often seems to happen in my class, as soon as the discussion really gets ramped up, I look at the clock and go, oh, shoot. And I'm doing that right now because it's officially 1:53. And so our time is technically up, although I'm willing to stay around. I don't know if our panelists can hang around in case anyone has any last questions. Otherwise, I'll see everyone on Wednesday. I'm shutting up in case anyone wants to ask any other questions. Class dismissed. Thank you to all of you people. Thank you. It was fabulous. It was really informative.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you all for the great discussion. Geoff, it's so great to meet you, and Jessica and Teresa and Lisa. I can't wait till we can be together in person again. And Maria, thank you so very much for pulling this together. What a great conversation.
Yes.
Thank you all for agreeing to be here. And just so great that we can have these conversations and have people from so many different backgrounds come together to talk about these things.
Excellent.
Okay, I guess there are no more questions.
No, we just got a conversation started. And Teresa, I should say I've had at least a couple of my students in class who've been in your class who said,